Now welcome to another lightning response video, where this time we got a rather fun question from Anton Io, who asked, "Hey Thor, for those who saw the OT, what do you think people thought the prequels would have looked like? I'm rewatching the OT right now, and what strikes me is how, in the context of the 70s/80s, there is a lot that implies the prequels were much different than what we ended up getting. While I like how the prequels turned out, corniness and all, I can't help but wonder about certain details that would have fit much differently in people's minds, such as the Jedi of the Republic wearing armor more akin to knights of yore, rather than the desert robes that Ben was wearing, or all Jedi lightsabers being blue and Luke's green only being because it was synthetic, or Padme dying much later into their kids' lives, or even what the Clone Wars were, and things like that." Okay, so as someone who can very much remember those days, who is old enough to remember the days long before the prequels ever came out, I can tell you they weren't anything like I personally expected them to be. Not that I remember ever really thinking too hard about what they were going to be like until we heard they were happening, or maybe I should say until they started to get close to release, till we started to learn more about them. Because if I recall right, they were announced, or Lucas said he was doing them in like 1994, maybe even as early as 93. And then of course they didn't come out, or Phantom Menace didn't come out till 1999. In other words, it's not like I spent 5 or 6 years pondering what they were going to be like as much as I just impatiently waited for them and kept reading expanded universe stories that were instructed by George Lucas himself to not really touch on the time period at all because he was doing the films. Anyway, like I was saying, I don't know or remember ever really thinking about what they'd be like all too much, or what the era would be like, other than maybe just having some vague impressions or thoughts in regards to it, most of which existed because of what was said about the era in A New Hope by Obi-Wan Kenobi, which is really the only time in the original trilogy where any sort of prequel era history is really talked about or touched upon, with Kenobi talking about fighting in the Clone Wars and being good friends with Luke's father and all of that, and how it was before the Dark Times, before the Empire. And even though he said that, the last part about being before the Empire, I always somehow assumed or imagined that the Empire had been around for a very, very long time, that it had existed alongside the Republic and they'd been at war for who knows how long, and that the Jedi were, well, sort of the generals of the Republic who were leading the fight against the Empire the whole time. I would have never ever guessed that the Empire was sort of brand new, again despite that line from Kenobi kind of implying it was, and that in all reality the Empire only lasted some 25 years. I also just assumed the Empire straight up conquered and defeated the Republic in a war, the Clone Wars, and that Vader or Anakin going to the dark side was some type of tipping point or turning point in the war. When we hear Obi-Wan say he hunted down and destroyed the Jedi, I always thought that was ultimately what won the war for the Empire. Along those same lines, I also thought there weren't that many Jedi, like maybe there were a few dozen and not some 10,000 that we see in the prequels or hear about in the prequels, which sure might sound kind of silly considering how huge the galaxy is and that a couple dozen Jedi would have a very hard time sort of policing it. But for one, as a kid, I don't think I kind of understood just how massive a galaxy is, that in theory, there could be millions upon millions of inhabited planets and different sentient species out there. And again, I thought they were more along the lines of generals who led armies, that their organization was something akin to the Knights of the Round Table, this very small, tight-knit group, which was probably put into my head thanks to Obi-Wan's good friends line. I didn't think they wore armor or anything quite like that. That thought, or how cool it could potentially look, never crossed my mind until actually seeing it in the Tartakovsky Clone Wars series. Though at the same time, I also didn't think they wore robes. I always just assumed that was what people on Tatooine wore, which, yeah, is kind of the case since others we see on the planet have the same kind of robes or look in general that Kenobi has. That's always been one of the strangest things to me, not that it bugs me that much, but it's always been odd that Obi-Wan essentially just kept wearing his Jedi robes as he's trying to hide, and that it was apparently also the in-style on Tatooine. The one thing I did imagine, or maybe actually think about, and quite a bit about, or wonder about, was the Clone Wars themselves. And I thought that, of course, the clones were created by the Empire, and that they were some type of monstrosities that were good at killing Jedi. I never ever thought they'd actually be fighting on the side of the Republic and with the Jedi. That would have never computed in my young brain. That, again, assumed abomination of some kind when I heard the word clone. Though that said, I also, back in the day, thought that stormtroopers were clones, and I don't know exactly why or where that thought came from, since, again, I thought the clones were monsters, and the stormtroopers clearly weren't monsters. I guess I thought that once the war was over, the Empire didn't need Jedi killing abominations anymore. They needed something more akin to a police force or an actual army. As for Padme, I don't know that I ever gave much thought to how Luke and Leia were separated and what their mother would have been like. Though it's interesting to note that back then it was before the no attachments and all of that we learn about in the prequels. So I didn't find it the least bit odd that Anakin would have fallen in love and had a wife and children and all of that. I kind of figured the Force was hereditary, and that of course Jedi Knights would want to, find someone to fall in love with and get married and have children to pass on the Force to the next generation. When Yoda tells Luke to pass on what he has learned in Return of the Jedi, I thought that meant not only train Leia so she could train her kids with Han, but that he should also have kids of his own to sort of repopulate the Jedi Order that he had, or his father had decimated. Not that he'd be out there hunting down other Force-sensitive people to train. But anyway, again, I don't know that I really thought too much about Luke and Leia's mother, that she would be anything special, or an elected queen at the age of 14 who eventually serves in the Senate. We have that one line from Luke in Return of the Jedi where he asks Leia if she remembers her mother, her real mother, and she says just a little bit. She died when I was very young, and she only remembers kind of feelings and images. And so I thought that whoever their mom was, that she kept Leia and gave Luke to Anakin's brother on Tatooine to hide him because Anakin would never visit his brother again. Which I thought Owen was, his real brother I mean, and not a stepbrother situation. And then eventually somehow their mother died and Leia was taken in by the Organas because, of course, Anakin's wife would have known them since General Kenobi served them, or served Bail Organa in the Clone Wars, which meant Anakin would have also served him by default, being Obi-Wan's friend and apprentice and all of that. So, of course, as a favor, they take Leia in. And I never realized or gave any real thought as to how Anakin or why Anakin didn't know he had kids. I mean, I guess the obvious answer was after turning to the dark side, he left his wife and he didn't really care anymore and didn't know she was pregnant. And she, shortly thereafter, died and that was it. He just stopped caring about any of that. And he never paid any attention to where the Organas got their daughter from. As for lightsabers, I don't know that I ever gave much thought to the colors of them or anything like that, why Luke had a green one in Return of the Jedi. I just kind of thought that Jedi had the cosmetic option of green or blue when they made a lightsaber, and that Sith always went red. I'd also have to say that, in a sense, Jar Jar was the biggest surprise of the prequels. I think one of the reasons why he was hated by some, and why the films were hated by some, is they were maybe expecting something a little more mature. That the films would be made for those who had grown up with those original films and not, in a sense, for the next generation as well, or for the kids of the new generation as well. Though that said, yes, Jar Jar is a bit much. I've never hated him, but I always thought he should have been a little toned down. You didn't have to put such a silly character in there in order to make it appeal to children. There's no Jar Jar in the original trilogy, and yet the kids of that generation loved those movies. As for how the story itself might go, or how the films might play out, again, I never really gave it all too much thought, but more or less figured it'd be about the Clone Wars and showcase Obi-Wan and Anakin fighting mutant clones before something turned Anakin to the dark side and he became Vader. Then he'd go on a Jedi killing spree and win the war for the Empire, and Obi-Wan and Yoda would go into hiding after Obi-Wan had defeated Anakin and turned him into the mechanical monster we see in the original trilogy. And that's about it. The fact that Anakin or the Skywalkers themselves might be anything special beyond just being a Jedi family that passed on the Force from generation to generation, that never really crossed my mind at all. The whole Chosen One thing might just be the biggest surprise in the prequels, in my opinion. That and Palpatine taking over the Republic from within. Like I said before, I just thought he'd always kind of been this evil empire who'd been fighting the Republic, and he finally won with the help of Darth Vader. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now I'd love to hear, assuming you're old enough to remember those days, what you thought the prequels or the era would be like before we ever got those films. Does my take sound anything like yours, or is it completely different? Also, feel free to ask a question for a future lightning response video. Just start your comment off with "Hey Thor" to get my attention. Whatever you choose to do, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.